Welcome back to more Warhammer lore. In this episode, we will be delving into the vampire accounts. Yet again. Possibly the last time for a little while. Just possibly. This time we will be looking into the life and death and second death of Isabella Von Carstein. As always, I will be pulling this information from the latest army books as well as the Warhammer fantasy novels. Also, this video will not be going into the end times, as she was a re-arisen character similar to Vlad, and for the longest time was actually dead in Warhammer canon. We will also go briefly into her inclusion in Total War Warhammer and her role in the Vampire Accounts roster. Isabella began her mortal life as Isabella Van Drak. The Van Draks were the ruling class of Sylvania before the takeover of their vampire overlords. Sylvania back then was not exactly a vacation spot, but it was habitable, and there were plenty of people inhabiting the province. The Van Draks had held power for quite some time, with their current Elector Count, Otto Van Drak, being their overlord and ruler. The Van Draks were known to be a little bloodthirsty in the way they ruled their province compared to others. In fact, their treatment of peasantry was more closely tied to the barbaric style of governing you might see in Bretonia. With regular meetings, bribes, and outright robbery on behalf of the Count carried out by his men and more nefarious business contacts. Everyone in Sylvania knew of the Van Draks and their inclination for violence, and so for the most part the common folk kept their heads down and obeyed their lords and ladies more out of fear than loyalty. In this way they were somewhat accustomed to what would be coming much later. Isabella, being the only child Otto ever sired, was treated with almost reverence by the people. She was far more beautiful than any of the peasantry, but she had a more wild look about her than most ladies of the courts of Sylvania. Even as a young girl, she was drawn to hunting, butchery, and horsemanship. She spent large amounts of her time in the wilderness, the gardens, and plazas of Castle Drakenhof, despite her tutor's attempts to teach her the more civilized traits of a lady. Things such as dancing, history, and courtly conduct were of little concern to the wild Isabella. Though she learned and obeyed her father out of fear for his wrath, but even he noticed her wild streak, especially in the way she enjoyed the public executions and lashings often put together to keep the rabble in check. At these events, Isabella would be wide-eyed, captivated by the violence, and most of all, the blood. Certainly something no lady should be enjoying. Isabella's tastes did not go unnoticed by the Count, but he honestly did not care much about what his daughter did in her spare time, as long as it didn't bring him any shame and she fulfilled her part as the dutiful daughter and lady of the castle. In this way, Isabella had some freedom, though not much, and her more outlandish tastes were reined in by her father. However, this could not last forever. The Count was growing old, and despite all the money and power he had amassed, he grew very ill, and he would surely die much sooner than he ever expected. His younger brother, a sniveling coward of a man, was chomping at the bit, anxiously awaiting the death of his brother. Repeatedly during this time, Isabella could feel her uncle's unclean gaze drift over her form like a wolf sizing up a sheep, and she knew that if he ever took over the province, she would not last long as the only legitimate heir to his brother's rule and possible distractions from his duties. Otto decided to send out a summons far and wide to present his daughter's hand in marriage to anyone of noble birth and willing to run the province of Sylvania. He did this more out of spite for his brother than Isabella's sake. In fact, he hadn't even asked her own thoughts on the matter, a point Isabella would come to resent as suitor after suitor came pawing after her status and wealth, all drawn by the prospect of becoming one of the fabled Elector Counts. However, not a single man stayed. Many found the province once actually seeing it to not be worth the effort, for who wants to rule over mostly swamp and marshland, where trade was scarce and monsters even more of a nuisance than any other fiefdom. Others found that they could not stand to rule over this backwater province for the prestige alone. But then they met Isabella, their bride-to-be. Isabella, feeling slighted by the indifference of the Van Drak men, made quite the show of her more exotic tastes, and one by one, the men fled the castle in terror of her, and what a life wed to her would promise. Soon, no more men came calling, and Otto was literally on his deathbed. Isabella's uncle, pacing about the room, barely able to hold in his excitement. Even though he was a cruel and harsh man on some level, he was still her father, and she did feel something at the thought of his passing. Maybe she shouldn't have turned them all away after all. It was then that a commotion came from the other room. There were shouts and a scuffling of feet. Then the chamber door opened as a tall man dressed in armor and a long cloak stepped into the room. He was powerfully built, with a smooth, almost waxy porcelain look to his skin. He strode in confidently, sizing up all the current occupants. His eyes were dark and seemed to draw in the light, almost captivating. The priest fainted, that was attending her father, and the good doctor moved to help the old man. "Who are you?" demanded Otto's brother as he closed the distance to this intruder. The man set down his cane. The handle was made of silver, with a wolf's head mounted for the grip. "I am Vlad Von Carstein, and I seek to answer your summons, Count Van Drak." "As you can see, you are too late. My brother is quite ill, and I will have you thrown from this castle window if you do not go back from whence you came." Vlad's voice was rough, but also soothing, and Isabella found herself more and more interested in this foreigner, if his accent was to be believed. Vlad looked down at the pathetic little man in front of him with barely restrained malice. "I don't have time for you, little man." His hand shot out for far quicker than anything Isabella had ever seen, and gripped her uncle's throat. He was lifted off the ground with one arm and brought to Von Carstein's eye level. "You will be quiet until my business is done." The man looked as if he was attempting to scream, but no sound came out, and Vlad threw him across the room in a feat of strength that did not go unnoticed. "Forgive me, my lady, one as beautiful as yourself should not have to suffer through the ramblings of lesser men, for you are like a rose amongst the thorns I have seen in this place." Isabella felt heat radiate to her face as she drank in the compliment, but more than that, she felt a kind of kinship with this man, a wild beast seeing its mate for the first time. They were the same in more ways than she realized, and she barely noticed that Vlad had taken her hand in his. It is custom for a lady to say yes at least once. "I will grant you the freedom you seek. And if it be in my power, I will see your every wish made true." This man seemed serious. Isabella was taken aback. No man had ever looked at her like this, and certainly had not spoken to her on even terms. She was right to turn all the others away, for she was meant to be with this man. But first a test, to see if he speaks true. Isabella spied her uncle still trying to scream with no sounds leaving his lips. She pulled her suitor in close and whispered in his ear, "If you will have my hand, I demand a boon. Think of it as a wedding present. I want his heart." A wolfish grin spread across her face, and Vlad, to her surprise, did not even blink. In fact, he appeared to possibly even be smirking himself. "As you wish." Vlad crossed the distance across the room in the blink of an eye, and once again held Otto's brother with one hand as the other plunged through the man's chest, and with what appeared to be minimal effort, ripped the still beating organ from the now corpse and allowed the body to crumple to the floor. He held out the heart to Isabella. She took it in both hands almost lovingly, and dropped it to the floor and licked the congealing blood from her hand. She locked eyes with her now husband and saw a sense of recognition and infatuation in the man. In that moment, Isabella knew without a doubt that she was meant for Vlad and he was meant for her. They were two halves of a twisted soul finally coming together. She threw herself onto the man and kissed him deeply, His skin was cold, and his mouth did not quite seem like that of a man's, but more of a wolf. The thought excited her even more, and with that Vlad and Isabella were married, and the current rulers of the province of Sylvania. The two were inseparable and spent most of their time together. Isabella had the freedom to do as she pleased, finally, not under the thumb of the Van Drax, and yet she spent all of her time in the castle or traveling with Vlad, visiting nobles and being seen by the common folk of his province. Under Vlad's rule, Sylvania grew, and people appeared to be the happiest Isabella had ever seen. Of course, many were still starving and disease-ridden, but the monsters were being held in check, and the usual bickering of the lesser nobles and their small fiefdoms was slowly but surely being condensed under one banner, the Von Carstein's banner. During this time, Isabella started to notice small things about her husband, unusual things. For one, he did not seem to eat, and he only drank wine from a certain bottle poured by his personal manservant. Not only that, he would not share it with even her. Then, of course, he appeared to not need to sleep, if any, at all. They had never truly spent a whole night together. Isabella was no fool, and over time she came to realize the true nature of her husband, until she finally confronted him about it, as was her own nature. Vlad, to her surprise, did not deny her accusations, and she in fact felt more in love with him for it. Then it dawned on her, Vlad was truly immortal, but she was not. She would get old. She would wither. She would die, while he stayed forever in his prime. And so she approached her husband and asked him to help her transition into one of the Arisen. Vlad, knowing what this curse would do to her, refused. "You don't know what you're asking." Isabella clenched her fist, as this was the first time he had ever defied her. "How can you say you love me if you will not let me spend eternity by your side? It is because I love you that I will not curse you to this existence." The same argument would be had over the years in different forms, but always with the same results. That is, until, very mysteriously, the Countess came down with the plague that had been ravaging the Sylvanian peasantry and began to waste away. Vlad, not knowing how this happened, did everything in his power to prevent the loss of his one true love, for he truly did love this mortal. Every day she would beg him for the blood kiss, and he would refuse, promising to cure her without it. This promise would inevitably be broken, as finally, after many days, Isabella was dying, and the Count, in a rage, threw all the healers and the holy men from her chambers, and locked himself inside. Isabella awoke near the brink of death to the feeling of her husband's lips against her neck. Slowly, gently, she felt her blood being drained by the Count, as if he wished as little pain to her as possible. Then, before she lost consciousness, she felt a warm fluid dripping down her throat, the coppery taint of blood. But somehow her strength was returning. Not only that, she felt power welling up inside her. She brought her hands up to her face and clenched the Count's arm tighter to her, drawing in more and more of the vampiric blood through the open wrist. She slurped and fed with a zeal that scared her husband, and he forcefully pried his arm from her grasp. "More. I need more. You have already taken more than any other. We are now bound. You must rest. I will be here when you awake." And with that, Isabella felt the call of the grave upon her, as the tainted blood slowed her heart and finally killed her. She awoke for the second time to the sight of her husband, though strangely, despite the curtains being drawn and the absence of any obvious lanterns, she could see him, easily, as if they were under a full moon. "Vlad, hush now, my love. You need rest and to feed." Isabella felt more invigorated than she had ever felt in life. It was strange. She could tell her heart was cold and still, but she could not feel the cold of the grave that clung to her new form. She did, however, feel an almost uncontrollable need to drink something, as if she had been marooned in a desert. We are now connected in a way no mortal can understand. We are truly part of one another. But first, a drink. Vlad snaps his fingers, and a manservant brings in a bottle of wine with 2 glasses. Isabella could smell the liquid before the bottle was even uncorked, and it took every ounce of her will not to snatch it from the human's fingers. In fact, she could hear his quickened pulse as she locked eyes with him, and taste the fear as easily as she had a perfume in life. That will be all. The manservant quickly left the room, and the Count and Countess drank their blood wine. It sated her thirst a little, but she needed more, and the Count knew she would. This was simply to tide her over before her first hunt. And with that, the 2 lovers left the castle as it was the dead of night, and Morsleb was hanging low, casting an eerie light across the landscape. The Count explained on the way over that there is a part of every immortal, an inner beast that will fight them for control. You should never give in to this beast completely, but it can be useful and will keep you from ever taking the final death. Under her husband's instructions, she gave in to her inner urges. Ironically, it felt completely natural, almost as if the woman she had been in life was preparing her for her undeath. She could smell living things in the woods, and before Vlad could direct her to the condemned men he had procured for her new awakening, she bolted into the woods. Vlad went after her, but she was fast, possibly even faster than himself. Isabella did not hear her husband calling for her. She was entranced on the pulse that she felt nearby, and after a few minutes, she came upon one of the great wolves famous in Sylvania. They are nearly the size of horses, dire wolves, and this beast was large for even its kind. Somehow, this drove Isabella into even more of a frenzy as she attacked the predator, whom quickly became the prey. Her supernatural movements and ferocity overwhelmed the great beast, and eventually she ripped open its throat and drained it dry. When Vlad finally found her following the smell of fresh blood, he found her cradling a great wolf's head in her lap, like 2 lovers taking in the night's air. She was covered in its gore. Not a speck of her flesh could be seen. Well, what have you done? The first kill is not supposed to be a beast? Isabella looked up at her husband after he spoke. My love, I am so very thirsty. Almost in a daze, Isabella absently stopped caressing the wolf and approached her husband. She could sense something different about him. He was looking at her in a new light. Was that possibly a hint of fear in his eyes? After Isabella was brought back to the castle and kept under watch, she would always be more attuned to the beasts and even animal-like hunger of her kind than any other. After her transformation, the bond between Vlad and Isabella was unbreakable, as ever, and the Count made the promise that he would never leave her again, and he would watch over her for all eternity. For her part, Isabella was completely enthralled with Vlad, whom allowed her to indulge in her animalistic urges from time to time, even letting her openly savage the meager human nobles one year on Snatch. There she drank and slaughtered like she never had before, becoming a true siren or bringer of death to the mortals. That night would mark the night her husband would set out at the head of the undead horde to conquer the empire. She would be his undying queen, and they would rule all of the world one day. Isabella cared little for strategy and politics, but she did relish the fighting, and despite Vlad's urging, she often found her way into battle, letting her inner beast off its very long leash and slaughtering with glee. However, all would not go as well as planned, for after one of their first victories, Vlad was cut down, his head cleaved from his shoulders by his own blade. At the sight of her husband crumpled form, something snapped in Isabella, and what little sanity she might still have had left. He won't leave me. He promised. He will come back. He will come back. This is where Posner found her, muttering to herself in her husband's tent, and tried to use her to win over the undead horde. Still in shock, she did not resist, simply walking by his side in a daze. That is until she heard her husband's voice. The undead horde split to reveal that Vlad had returned, like he said. Overcome with emotion, she ran to her lover and fell at his feet, tears of blood staining her dress. Vlad reached down and held her close before asserting his dominance over the horde and allowing Isabella to kill the usurper. However, Isabella was never quite the same. Perhaps it was the beast blood she had taken in, or maybe it was the sight of her husband's mangled corpse after the countless battles. But the Isabella that had left Sylvania all those years ago was not the one standing outside of Altdorf. She was more feral, crazed, prone to talking to herself and almost manic about losing her love. That was when it finally happened. Vlad von Carstein met his final death at the hand of a mere mortal, and his undead horde collapsed. Isabella, seeing this all happen, went into shock. All of her strength and vitality drained away. Nothing mattered anymore. Her only love had taken the true death. He was gone. He had left her. He said he would never leave her. Before she realized it, Isabella was captured by the Church of Sigmar and taken captive beneath the church in a dungeon. Attempts were made to interrogate her, but to no avail. Eventually, after spending many years in a cell, mumbling to herself and screaming, she was put out of her misery to join her husband in the final death. Some would say it was a mercy, for even a beast deserves mercy when it is suffering. And that is the life, death, and first, technically final death of Isabella von Carstein. Now, I will not be going into the end times, because she does actually have a part to play in that, but it gets way too complicated, and one day, probably far, far from now, I will actually get to the end times. Instead, we should get into Isabella's inclusion in Total War. Isabella is the newest vampire legendary lord added to the roster. She has a niche in that she actually gives pretty significant combat buffs to your more bestial creatures. She's very unique in the roster for this reason. This is more in reference to her character in the lore being more attuned to that sort of thing. She is not a combat monster, but no slouch either, and her blood chalice is actually very powerful in the campaign. Sadly, she's not exactly the best lord for multiplayer. She also gets a leadership buff identical to Vlad's when being reinforced by his army, in reference to their undying love for each other. Also in campaign, the von Carsteins, Vlad and Isabella, are the only legendary lords that, if you are one or the other, can be instantly recruited without performing some milestone or some feat to unlock them, just to show that they have such a close-knit relationship with one another. And that will bring us to a close on this lore video on Isabella von Carstein. She is an interesting character, especially for a von Carstein, as she's much more feral than most, and probably has more in common with a Strigoi, but she still has that von Carstein class, that charm. Her and Vlad are probably my favorite pairing in Warhammer Fantasy, just because it is that Joker-Harley, crazy love kind of dichotomy. Now, as always, if you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I will do my best to either answer them or put them in a future video. This will be the last vampire-focused video for a little while, despite maybe a Q&A session. The other legendary lords will be hit up at a later date. I am just a little burnt out on vampires. I'm sure you are as well. There will, of course, be more Warhammer lore coming your way. I would also like to thank all of you, my loyal subscribers especially, for putting up with the recent delays and lack of consistent schedule. I do apologize, but unfortunately I have to keep up, work and stuff, so I can actually keep doing this. As always, guys, I have been Jumbo Thick. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Have a good day.